Hello, this is Professor Harper, and I'd like to start our examination of the First Amendment, trying to kind of break it down, with the issue of free speech. And for the most part, in legal cases, freedom of speech and freedom of press are put together. But let's look at free speech. So there have been a variety of laws restricting free speech, a variety of laws um, not restricting free speech, expanding free speech, court cases involving it, and for the most part, freedom of speech and freedom of the press wins the day. But in some cases, it does not. So we start out with the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, which made it a crime punishable by up to $2,000 and 2 years in imprisonment to publish, quote, any false, scandalous, and malicious writing with the intent to stir up contempt for the federal government, government officials, or their official acts. Now, there were defenses. Truth was allowed as a defense. But the law was enforced to punish political opponents of the Federalists, President John Adams, and it's generally thought that he lost his second term, re-election to a second term because of this law, and Thomas Jefferson became president. It was opposed as unconstitutional by some of the founders, including James Madison, but not all opposition was based on the First Amendment. Many opposed the act because it infringed upon the state's right to regulate expression. The scope of the First Amendment, the U.S. Supreme Court did not begin to interpret the scope of the First Amendment until really after World War I. Before this involvement, there was widespread suppression of speech at the state level. During the Civil War, for example, speech was restricted in the North against those who opposed the war effort, and in the South against those who held abolitionist and anti-slavery views. But in World War I, we got the clear and present danger standard, and that is primarily because Congress enacted the Espionage Act of 1917. Now, the Espionage Act is still in force, and it's something that we'll talk about later, but the Obama administration has used the Espionage Act of 1917 8 times during the administration, which is more than all of the previous administrations combined. There were also restrictions in World War I, primarily in the states, to prevent speech against the war effort in World War I. Then we come up to several laws that were several cases that were decided. The first one was Schenck v. United States. And Schenck was the head of the Socialist Party, and he was convicted under the Espionage Act for distributing leaflets urging people to defy the military. His conviction was upheld by a unanimous Supreme Court. And here's where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes created the clear and present danger standard. He argued that the freedom of speech was not absolute, and he used as an example one you probably heard many times, falsely crying fire in a crowded theater. Now you know where it comes from. And also circumstances in time of war give Congress the right to suppress speech that presents a clear and present danger to the government. Now, Holmes decided that his theory wasn't a particularly good one in the next case where it came up, and so he abandoned his support for the theory, and ultimately the clear and present danger clause was amended, adapted as we go along. So Schenck was followed by Frowert v. the United States, Debs v. the United States, Abrams v. the United States, all in 1919. And as I mentioned, Justice Holmes wrote a dissent in Abrams in which he said he saw no significant threat by leaflets from small organizations. So he reinterpreted his support for clear and present danger and actually came out against it in the same year. In World War II, there were other restrictions on freedom of speech. There was a sedition law, the Smith Act, and the act was used to prosecute communists. Its constitutionality was upheld in 1951, and in 1957 there was a distinction made between teaching the desirability of violently overthrowing the government as an abstract theory and actually advocating violent action. So we get a little more interpretation on the freedom of speech standard. Now, here's a case which is generally thought to be a really bad decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, Brandenburg v. Ohio. And it happened in 1969, and essentially it said that it was okay to burn a cross as long as it was not directly threatening to a family. So, but it gave us some more interpretations about the clear and present danger theory, or the threat to national security, or creating a threat, an imminent threat to individuals. So the advocacy of a clear and present danger, it essentially said that imminent lawless action replaced the clear and present danger. And what this meant was the speech likely or action likely to incite or produce immediately rather than sometimes a violent action. And it's a pro-Ku Klux Klan ruling that is still debated today. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, Fighting Words, Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire is really in-your-face words that are offensive. Okay, so I mean right in your face, not standing back and using hate speech, okay, but in your face. So Walter Chaplinsky angered a crowd in Rochester, New Hampshire, with his, really off-the-wall preaching, and a city traffic officer asked Chaplinsky to go with him to the police station because he was being disruptive. And on the way, there was a Rochester city marshal who had earlier told Chaplinsky to cool it. Okay, and so when Marshall repeated his warning, Chaplinsky called him a damned racketeer, a damned fascist, and charged that the whole government of Rochester were fascists or agents of fascists. Okay, this went too far. Okay, so Chaplinsky was prosecuted under a New Hampshire law that prohibits only those words directly tending to cause a breach of peace by provoking the person addressed to acts of violence. Okay, he was convicted of doing that. He lost his appeal, and then he went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he lost there too. So freedom of speech, freedom of press is not absolute. Okay, there are other cases that are kind of a mixed bag. There was a draft card burning case in 1968. Essentially, O'Brien lost this case before the Supreme Court because the draft card was considered property of the U.S. government, and therefore he was defacing property of the U.S. government, and it was not protected as freedom of speech. But as a parenthetical insert here, actions can also be considered speech, even though you don't say something. In this one, the government action, it was a question of individual expression versus government rights. This was government property, and so therefore O'Brien lost the case. There's a flag burning case, a famous one in 1984, Texas v. Johnson. Gregory Johnson burned a flag outside of the GOP convention in Dallas, and this speech was protected, even though it is offensive to many, it's still controversial today with attempts to create a constitutional amendment to make it against the law, but so far those efforts have failed. RAV versus St. Paul is a cross was burned in front of a house of an African American family who moved into a white neighborhood. It was determined that there was an unclear motivation in this case, whether it was directed specifically at the family or in general, and so RAV, which was an acronym for a person under the age of 18, was found that this was protected speech. There's a similar one in Virginia v. Black, which finds that intimidating words can in fact be protected. Read hate speech. Then we have a further expansion of freedom of speech when it comes to political campaign donations. Very controversial decision, but in this case, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, it held that the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting independent political expenditures by corporations and unions. It basically surrounded a desire by a group opposed to Hillary Clinton to air a critical film, and that was stopped, but then it was overturned by the federal election, by the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a split decision of 5-4, and Justice Kennedy, who often is a swing vote, he argued that the First Amendment does not distinguish between media and other corporations, and that these restrictions would allow Congress to suppress political speech if there were restrictions on campaign funds. And the majority argued that the First Amendment must protect speakers with equal vigor, and that the First Amendment does not tolerate prohibitions of speech based on the identity of the speaker. And then that was expanded upon in 2014 with McCutcheon versus the Federal Elections Commission. And essentially what this did is that there were restrictions on how much money an individual could spend, and so these were greatly modified by the U.S. Supreme Court to make it much easier for individuals to expend more, to contribute more funds to the campaign. So, it kind of goes, in a variety of directions. Some restrictions early on with respect to freedom of speech, and read freedom of press there as well. And then greater expansion, some would say, to parts of freedom of speech that should not be protected later on. And today there are very few limitations on freedom of speech. So that's what we have for today, and we'll see you online.